On the night of October 22, 1707, off the southwest tip of England, a fleet of the most powerful navy on Earth sailed straight onto the rocks in the dark. A fleet was coming home from war in the Mediterranean, under one of the most respected admirals Britain had, Sir Cloudesley Shovel. The men aboard were not fools. They had charts, they had compasses. Between them they carried decades of hard sea experience. For days they had been taking soundings and arguing over their position, because nobody on those ships could say for certain where they were. They believed they were safely west of the Isles of Scilly, those scattered rocks and islands at the mouth of the English Channel. They were wrong. They were almost on top of them. The Flagship Association struck first and went down in minutes, then the Eagle, then the Romney, then the fireship Firebrand. In the space of a single black, storm-blown night, 4 warships were torn open and dragged under, and somewhere between 1,400 and 2,000 men drowned in the cold water within sight of home. The admiral's body washed ashore on a beach in Scilly. It was one of the worst disasters in the history of the Royal Navy, and it had not been caused by an enemy, or a hurricane, or cowardice. It was caused by a number nobody on those ships could find. They knew how far north they were. They had no reliable way to know how far east or west. They did not know their longitude, and it killed them. This is the story of that missing number. It was a problem so deep that the finest mathematicians and astronomers in Europe chipped away at it for almost 200 years and could not crack it. Kings offered fortunes for the answer. Galileo had tried. Isaac Newton thought it could never be done by a clock at all. And the man who finally solved it was not a professor, not an astronomer, not a gentleman of science. He was the son of a carpenter from a small village in Yorkshire, a man with almost no formal schooling, who taught himself everything he knew and built the answer out of brass and steel with his own hands. His name was John Harrison, and for that answer, he would fight the most powerful scientific establishment in the world for 40 years. To understand why his clock mattered so much, you have to understand the problem, because it is one of those things that sounds simple and is anything but. Picture the Earth as a grid. The lines running across it, north to south, are latitude, and latitude was easy. Sailors had measured it for thousands of years. At noon, you measure the height of the sun above the horizon, or at night, you find the North Star, and the angle tells you how far north or south of the equator you are. A shepherd could learn it. The trouble was the other set of lines, running from pole to pole, longitude. Those lines tell you how far east or west you have traveled, and there is nothing in the sky that points to them. The stars wheel overhead the same way, whether you are off the coast of Portugal or in the middle of the open Atlantic. But there was a way, in theory, and clever men had understood it for a long time. The Earth turns once every 24 hours, a full 360 degrees. That works out to 15 degrees of turn every hour. So if you could somehow know what time it was right now back at your home port, and compare that to the local time where your ship actually was, the gap between the two clocks would tell you your longitude. Find local noon on the ship by watching the sun climb to its highest point. Then check your home clock. If your home port reads 3 in the afternoon when it is noon on your deck, you are 3 hours, or 45 degrees, west of home. The math was not the hard part. School children could do the math. The hard part was the clock, because to make this work, you needed a clock that could leave London, sail for months across a heaving ocean, through tropical heat and freezing nights, through salt spray and damp, while the ship rolled and pitched, and keep near-perfect time the entire way. Lose a few seconds a day, and after a long voyage, you would be off by hundreds of miles, which on a dark night near a rocky coast was the difference between a safe harbor and a grave. And in the early 1700s, no such clock existed, not close. The best clocks in the world were pendulum clocks, and a pendulum needs to hang still and swing in steady gravity. Put it on a ship, and the rolling deck throws the swing off completely. Heat makes the metal parts expand, and the clock runs slow. Cold makes them contract, and it runs fast. The thick oil that lubricated the gears got gummy in the cold and thin in the heat, changing the speed. To the great minds of the day, building a clock that could beat all of that at once seemed not just difficult, but flatly impossible. So they looked to the heavens instead. The astronomers were sure the answer was in the sky, in measuring angles between the moon and the stars, and reading the time off the universe like a giant clock face. That belief, that the solution had to be an astronomer's solution, would matter enormously later. Remember it. For now, just know the stakes. By the early 18th century, ships were the lifeblood of empires. Trade, war, exploration, the wealth of nations rode on wooden hulls across thousands of miles of water, and they were sailing half-blind. Ships missed islands they were aiming for. Whole crews died of scurvy drifting in the wrong part of the ocean because a voyage took weeks longer than planned. And sometimes, like that night off Scilly, they simply sailed into rocks they did not know were there. Sailors had a grim joke that they were navigating by guess and by God. The Scilly disaster in 1707 was the shock that finally moved a government to act. 7 years later, in 1714, the British Parliament passed what became known as the Longitude Act. It set up a panel of experts, the Board of Longitude, made up of admirals and astronomers and mathematicians and politicians, and it dangled the biggest cash prize the world had ever seen for a scientific problem. The full reward was £20,000 for any method that could find a ship's longitude to within half a degree at the end of a long ocean voyage. In the money of today, that prize was worth several $1 million, a fortune that could set a man and his family up for life and then some. The terms were brutally strict. Half a degree of longitude was only about 30 miles. To win the top prize, your method had to carry a ship all the way to the West Indies, a voyage of 6 weeks or more, and still be accurate to within those 30 miles at the far end. For a clock, that meant losing no more than about 3 seconds a day, every day, for months, on the deck of a pitching ship. 3 seconds a day. The best land-based clocks of the era, sitting perfectly still in a quiet room, could not always promise that. So the prize sat there, year after year, like a locked door. Cranks and dreamers sent the board their schemes. Chains of moored ships firing cannons on the hour. Wounded dogs treated with a magic powder that would supposedly make them yelp at a set time. The serious money, the establishment money, stayed on the astronomers and their method of the moon. The clock was a dead end. Everyone knew that. Everyone except a young man in the north of England who had never been told it was impossible. John Harrison was born in 1693 in Falby, a tiny village in Yorkshire. His father was a carpenter, a working man who shaped wood for the local estate, and John was the eldest of a large family. He grew up around tools and timber and was raised to follow his father into the trade. There was no money for a real education, no university in his future, no learned tutors. What he had was a hungry, restless mind and a pair of hands that could make almost anything. There is a story from his childhood, and like a lot of stories about famous men, it may have grown in the telling, but it fits him. When he was around 6, he came down with smallpox, and while he lay sick, someone set a ticking watch on his pillow to keep him company. The boy lay there for hours, listening to it, watching the hands, working out in his head how the little machine could measure something as invisible as time. Whether or not that exact moment happened, the obsession it describes was real, and it never left him. He was largely self-taught. A visiting clergyman once lent him a set of lecture notes on natural philosophy, the science of the day, and the young Harrison copied the entire thing out by hand, word for word and diagram for diagram, so he could keep it and study it. That was how a poor boy in a Yorkshire village got an education in the 1700s. You found a book of knowledge, and if you could not own it, you wrote it out yourself. In 1713, when he was just 20, he built his first clock. Now think about who he was. He was a carpenter, not a metalworker, and brass and iron were expensive. So he did the most natural thing in the world for a man who worked in wood. He built the entire clock out of wood. The gears, the wheels, the moving parts, all of it cut from timber. And here is the genius hiding inside that limitation. Harrison realized that one particular wood, lignum vitae, a dense tropical hardwood, is naturally oily. It secretes its own waxy lubricant from inside the grain. So a clock made with lignum vitae gears never needed oiling and never got gummy in the cold or thin in the heat, because the problem of the changing oil simply did not exist. He had not set out to solve a longitude problem. He had just been a poor man making do with the material he knew. But he had stumbled onto a principle that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The idea of a clock that needed no oil at all. His wooden clocks were extraordinary. A couple of them still run today, 300 years later. He kept improving them, and along the way he engineered his way around the central enemies of accurate timekeeping. He hated friction, because friction means oil, and oil means trouble. So he designed an escapement, the part that controls the steady release of the clock's power, that barely touched itself as it worked. It rocked back and forth with a little kicking motion, and people called it the grasshopper escapement, because that is exactly what it looked like, two delicate arms hopping. It needed almost no lubrication at all. Then he went after temperature. Metal grows when it heats and shrinks when it cools, and that tiny change ruins a pendulum's timing. So Harrison built a pendulum out of alternating rods of two different metals, brass and steel, arranged so that as one set of rods expanded with the heat, the other set pulled the opposite way and canceled it out. The pendulum's effective length stayed exactly the same in summer and winter. He called it the gridiron pendulum, and it worked beautifully. This idea, two metals balanced against each other to defeat temperature, was one of the most important things he ever figured out, and you will find its descendants in machines all over the modern world. By the late 1720s, Harrison was a respected clockmaker in the north of England, building the most accurate timekeepers anyone in the region had ever seen, and he knew about the prize, £20,000, waiting for the man who could build a clock to go to sea. So in 1730, this carpenter's son did something that took real nerve. He drew up his designs and traveled to London to knock on the door of the most famous scientific institution in the world. He went looking for Edmund Halley, the astronomer royal, the man the comet is named after. Halley listened to him, and here is the first crack in the wall Harrison would spend his life pushing against. Halley was an astronomer, and the official solution to longitude was supposed to be an astronomer's solution. A self-taught clockmaker from Yorkshire showing up with a plan to win it with a machine did not fit the picture at all. But to his great credit, Halley did not turn the man away. He sent Harrison to the finest clockmaker in London, a man named George Graham. Harrison turned up at Graham's door at 10 in the morning, nervous and unannounced, and the two of them talked clockwork until 8 that night. Graham, who could easily have seen this provincial nobody as a rival or a fool, instead saw what he was. He was so impressed that he lent Harrison the money to get started, interest-free, no rush to pay it back. It was one of the few moments of pure generosity in this whole long story, and Harrison went home to Yorkshire with the backing he needed to begin the real work. He spent the next 5 years building a single clock. When it was finished, around 1735, it was unlike anything on Earth. It stood about 4 feet in every direction and weighed roughly 75 pounds, a gleaming machine of brass rods and balanced springs and those hopping grasshopper arms. Today we call it H1, the first of his sea clocks. The brilliance of it was that it had no pendulum at all. Harrison knew a pendulum could never survive a rolling ship, so he replaced it with 2 large weighted bars connected by springs swinging against each other. When the ship rolled one way, and tried to throw off one bar, it threw off the other in the opposite direction at the same instant, and the two motions canceled. The clock did not care which way the deck tilted. It kept its own time, no matter what the sea did under it. Harrison brought H1 to London, and this time, the scientific world took real notice. The Royal Society, the very heart of British science, examined it and was astonished. They gave it their stamp of approval. In 1736, the board arranged a trial, and H1 was loaded aboard a Royal Navy warship, HMS Centurion, bound for Lisbon and back. On the voyage home, the clock proved its worth in a way nobody could argue with. As the ship approached land, the sailing master, an experienced navigator, calculated their position by the old methods and announced where he believed they were. Harrison, reading his clock, disagreed, placing the ship off a different point of the English coast. The clock turned out to be right. The master's own figures had been off by around 60 miles. A wooden box of springs built by a carpenter had just beaten a professional navigator at his own job. It was a triumph. And here is where most people think the story ends, with the prize and the glory. It is barely the beginning, because what Harrison did next tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He could have pushed for the prize right then. H1 had performed. Instead, John Harrison looked at his own masterpiece, the machine that had made him famous, and decided it was not good enough. He had found flaws in it, small ones, that nobody else would have cared about, and they bothered him. So he asked the board for money to build a better one, and went back to his workbench. He spent the next 2 years building the second clock, H2, and when he finished it, he discovered a subtle flaw in how it handled the rolling of a ship, and he refused to send it to sea at all. He simply set it aside. Years of work, abandoned because it was not perfect. Then he started on the third clock, H3. And this is where the obsession turns into something almost frightening. Harrison worked on H3 for 19 years, nearly 2 decades on a single timepiece, refining and rebuilding and refining again. Along the way, wrestling with that machine, he invented something that has outlived everything else he made. To beat the temperature changes inside the clock's tiny balance wheel, he riveted together a thin strip of 2 different metals, brass on one side and steel on the other. When the temperature rose, the 2 metals expanded at different rates, and because they were locked together, the strip bent. He used that bending to automatically adjust the clock and cancel out the heat. He had invented the bimetallic strip. Stop and think about where that little invention lives now. The bimetallic strip is in the thermostat on your wall. It was in old toasters and ovens, in fire alarms, in the blinker of an old car, in countless thermometers and electrical switches. A self-taught clockmaker, trying to keep a sea clock accurate so that sailors would stop drowning, invented a piece of technology that ended up quietly running the temperature controls of the modern world. He developed a new kind of nearly frictionless bearing along the way too. The man could not stop solving problems. But after 19 years, H3 still did not quite satisfy him. It was magnificent, and it still was not the clock he could see in his mind. And by now, Harrison was no longer a young man. He had been chasing this prize for the better part of his life. The Board of Longitude had been giving him small payments over the years to keep him going, but they were getting impatient. Decades had passed. Where was the clock that would win the prize? And then, somewhere in those long years bent over H3, John Harrison had the insight that changed everything. He had spent his life assuming the sea clock had to be big and heavy, with great swinging bars, to ride out the motion of a ship. But while H3 was being built, he had quietly commissioned a small pocket watch for his own use, made to his specifications. And watching it run, he realized he had been wrong all along. A small, fast-beating watch, with the right design, could be more stable than a giant one, not less. The future was not a clock the size of a stove. It was a watch you could hold in your hand. So in his 60s, after a lifetime of building enormous machines, John Harrison started over one more time and built a watch. He finished it in 1759, H4, and it was beautiful. It looked like an oversized pocket watch, about 5 inches across, in a plain silver case, the kind of thing a gentleman might carry, except that inside, it ticked 5 times a second and held its time with an accuracy that no watch in history had ever come close to. Harrison, who was not a modest man about his work and had earned the right not to be, said it was the most accurate timepiece the world had ever seen and that he was prouder of it than of anything he had ever made. He was right. Now all that was left was to prove it at sea and collect the prize he had chased for 30 years. He was 68, too old for a long ocean voyage, so he sent his son. William Harrison had grown up in the workshop, had learned the clocks from his father's hands, and he loved his father fiercely. William would carry H4 to the West Indies and defend it before the board. The two of them had no idea that the hardest fight of all was still in front of them, and it would not be against the sea, it would be against the very men who were supposed to award the prize. In November of 1761, William Harrison boarded a ship called the Deptford with the watch and sailed for the island of Jamaica. Before they left, the watch was sealed and its time set against the observatory, and from that moment, everything depended on the little machine in its box. At one point in the voyage, the ship's officers were convinced they had run far past the island of Madeira and were lost. William, reading H4, insisted they were almost exactly on course, and that Madeira lay dead ahead. The captain, against his own judgment, trusted the watch. The next morning, the island rose out of the sea, right where the watch said it would be. The captain was so impressed, he tried to buy the next watch Harrison made. When the Deptford finally reached Jamaica, the moment of truth came. They checked the watch against the known local time. After roughly 2.5 months at sea, crossing the Atlantic through the heat of the tropics, H4 had lost only a tiny handful of seconds. The exact figure has been retold many ways, but it was something on the order of 5 seconds over the whole voyage, which put the ship's position off by only about a mile. The requirement to win the full £20,000 prize was 30 miles. Harrison had not just met the standard, he had crushed it, beaten it by a factor of more than 30 to 1. It was over. The carpenter's son had done the impossible. The greatest scientific prize in the world was his. Except it was not. And here is where this stops being a story about a clock and becomes a story about pride and class and the way powerful institutions protect their own. When William came home to claim the prize, the Board of Longitude did not hand it over. They balked. There were procedural questions, they said. Perhaps the watch's success on this one voyage had been luck. Perhaps the result had been a fluke of a single good crossing. The standards had to be confirmed. They offered Harrison a fraction of the money and demanded another trial. To understand why they fought him so hard, you have to look at who now held real power on that board. Remember how the establishment always believed the answer to longitude would come from the astronomers, from the moon and the stars, not from a machine. The leading champion of that astronomical method was a young, brilliant, ambitious clergyman and astronomer named Neville Maskelyne. Maskelyne had spent years developing the rival solution, called the lunar distance method, which found longitude by carefully measuring the angle between the moon and certain stars and grinding through pages of complicated calculations. It was a real and clever method, and it worked, after a fashion, in the hands of a trained astronomer with hours to spare and clear skies overhead. Maskelyne believed in it completely and had staked his reputation on it. And in 1765, in the middle of Harrison's fight for the prize, Neville Maskelyne was appointed Astronomer Royal. That title gave him a seat on the Board of Longitude. The man whose own life's work was the direct competitor to Harrison's clock was now one of the judges deciding whether Harrison's clock had won, a judge ruling on a contest he himself was trying to win. To Harrison, it must have felt like every door slamming at once. The board ordered a second trial, this time to the island of Barbados, in 1764, and they sent Maskelyne himself along on the expedition to test his own lunar method head-to-head against the watch. H4 went too, with William Harrison defending it. The old man's son and the watch against the Astronomer Royal and the establishment, side by side on the same ocean. The watch won again. On the Barbados voyage, H4 found the longitude of the island with an error of about 10 miles, well inside the prize limit, while Maskelyne's astronomical method, in his own hands, came in less accurate and required hours of difficult calculation that an ordinary ship's officer could never have managed in rough weather. By any fair reading, the clock had beaten the stars a second time, decisively, on a separate ocean, watched by its own rival. It still was not enough. The board moved the goalposts again. Now they decided that a single watch proving itself was not the same as a solution the Navy could actually use. How did they know Harrison had not just gotten lucky building one freak machine that could never be copied? They demanded that he hand over H4 and all its secrets, take the entire watch apart in front of their appointed experts, and explain every spring and gear so the design could be reproduced by other makers. And they demanded he build still more copies to prove the thing was not a one-off miracle. Harrison was now over 70 years old. The watch was his masterpiece, the product of a lifetime, and the board was ordering him to dismantle it and surrender the deepest secrets of his craft, the secrets he had bled for, to the very men who had spent years denying him. He felt, in his own words, that he was being extremely ill-used. He had every reason to. They paid him part of the money, £10,000, but only on these humiliating conditions, and they held back the rest. They held the full reward just out of his reach, year after year, while an old man grew older. Most people, by this point, would have broken. Harrison did not. He took H4 apart for them, under protest. And then, refusing to be beaten, this man in his late 70s sat down and built yet another watch, a fifth one, H5, to prove all over again that he could do it on demand, that it was no fluke, and he found a new ally, the most powerful one possible. King George III had a personal interest in science and in clocks, and when he learned how the old clockmaker had been treated, he was furious on Harrison's behalf. In 1772, the king had H5 brought to his own private observatory at Richmond, and there, with William Harrison present, the king personally tested the watch over 10 weeks, taking the readings himself day after day. The watch performed superbly. Over those weeks, it kept time to within about 1/3 of a second a day, a standard that made a mockery of every doubt the board had raised. According to the story handed down, the king was so outraged by how Harrison had been treated that he swore he would see the old man righted, and he advised Harrison to go over the board's head and petition Parliament directly. The exact words the king used are part of legend now, and we cannot prove them, but his anger and his help were real. With the king behind him, Harrison did petition Parliament, and in 1773, the lawmakers finally acted where the board would not. They granted John Harrison a further award of £8,750 in recognition of his life's achievement. He was 80 years old. Between that grant, the earlier payments from the board, and the interim money, he had received in total a little over £23,000 across his lifetime for solving the longitude problem, even more, in the end, than the original prize was worth in pounds. But notice what never happened. The Board of Longitude never formally declared that John Harrison had won the prize. There was no ceremony, no official pronouncement that the carpenter's son had defeated the greatest scientific challenge of the age. He got the money, dragged out of a reluctant establishment by an old man's stubbornness and a king's anger. But the people who had been appointed to honor the achievement never quite brought themselves to say the words. The recognition he had earned over half a century was given grudgingly, late, and without grace. John Harrison died 3 years later, in 1776, at his home in London, on the 24th of March, which by chance was his 83rd birthday. He had spent more than 40 years, the better part of an entire human life, solving one problem the smartest men in the world had called impossible. He had been right, and he had outlasted everyone who doubted him. And here is the part that turns the whole long, bitter struggle into something that touched millions of lives. Harrison's design worked. Within a few decades, watchmakers learned to build copies of his sea clock, refined and made cheaper to produce. They came to be called chronometers when Captain James Cook sailed off to map the vast, empty reaches of the Pacific. He carried a copy of Harrison's watch and used it to chart islands and coastlines with an accuracy no one before him had managed. Cook called it his trusty friend, the timekeeper that never let him down. By the early 1800s, the marine chronometer was standard equipment on ships around the world. For the first time in human history, a ship's captain could know, on any morning in the middle of any ocean, exactly where on the surface of the earth he was. The guessing was over. The drowning by ignorance, the crews lost to scurvy in the wrong latitude, the fleets sailing onto rocks they could not see, all of it began to fall away. It is impossible to count how many sailors lived out their lives instead of vanishing into the sea because of one obstinate man's brass watch. But the number is surely in the many thousands. That is the strange power hidden in this story. We tend to picture history's great turning points as battles and revolutions, and the speeches of famous men. But sometimes the thing that changes the world is quieter than that. Sometimes it is one ordinary person with no title and no fortune and no permission from anyone who looks at a problem everyone has agreed to call impossible and simply refuses to agree. Harrison was not a genius the way the world expected its geniuses to look. He was a craftsman. He worked slowly, with his hands, alone, for decades, fixing one tiny flaw and then the next, never satisfied, never quitting, ignoring the men in their fine coats who told him an unschooled carpenter could not solve what Newton could not. The next time you find your exact position on a map without a second thought, on a screen in your pocket that knows precisely where you are standing on the face of the earth, it is worth remembering where the idea behind it began. It began with the gap between two clocks. It began with the simple, stubborn notion that if you could carry your home time with you across the world, you would never be lost, and it was made real against the doubt of an entire age by the son of a Yorkshire carpenter who taught himself everything he knew and then beat the best minds in Europe at a game they swore could not be won. His clocks are still running today, kept ticking in a museum in Greenwich, the same brass arms still hopping like grasshoppers after 300 years, still keeping time, the way the man who built them never stopped. If you found yourself caught up in this one, and you want more forgotten stories like it, the ones history almost left behind, take a second to subscribe.